The room was quiet. No shouting, no slammed doors, no raised voice. Dwight D. Eisenhower sat behind his desk, hands folded, eyes steady. Across from him stood George S. Patton, the most feared, admired, and controversial general in the United States Army. Patton had survived scandals before. He had survived outrage, investigations, public humiliation. He believed, as he always had, that results erase sins, that victory forgave everything. Eisenhower let the silence stretch. Then he spoke. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't even an argument. It was one sentence, calm, measured, final. And when Patton heard it, he understood something he had never fully accepted before. This time, there would be no rescue. For years, history has reduced Patton's removal from command to a simple explanation: scandals, temper, disobedience. A brilliant general who went too far, a man undone by his own mouth. But that is not the real story.
The real story is about why Eisenhower tolerated Patton for so long, why he defended him when no one else would, and why, in the end, Eisenhower decided that even victory was not worth the cost. This was not a clash between a good man and a bad one. It was a collision between two visions of leadership and two ideas of what war demanded. Patton believed war was won by aggression, fear, and unstoppable force. He believed restraint was weakness and hesitation was betrayal. To him, soldiers existed to fight, and those who could not fight were already lost. Eisenhower believed something different. He believed wars were won not just on battlefields, but in conference rooms, alliances, and fragile political balances. He understood that one reckless man, no matter how brilliant, could fracture everything they were trying to build. For a long time, Eisenhower tried to balance both worlds. He needed Patton's fire, but he feared Patton's flame. And as the war dragged on, that balance became impossible. The sentence Eisenhower spoke that day was not about punishment. It was about limits. Limits of tolerance, limits of loyalty, limits of how much chaos even victory could excuse. To understand why that moment mattered, why it was inevitable, you have to understand who George Patton really was, long before that room ever went quiet. George Smith Patton Jr. did not become who he was by accident. He was shaped, deliberately and obsessively, into a warrior long before the world ever went to war. From childhood, Patton believed he was destined for greatness. Not hoped, destined. He read ancient history the way other boys read adventure novels. Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Hannibal. To Patton, these were not distant figures. They were standards to be matched, ghosts to be honored. He believed he had lived before. He believed he had died in battle before. And he believed, without irony, that he would be remembered as one of history's great captains, if the world gave him the chance. That belief fueled everything. Patton trained harder than those around him. He pushed himself physically to the edge of collapse. He obsessed over discipline, appearance, ritual. The polished helmet, the ivory-handled pistols, the rigid posture. None of it was vanity in his mind. It was theater with a purpose. Fear was a weapon. Confidence was contagious. Image mattered. To Patton, a soldier who looked unstoppable often became unstoppable. But there was a darker side to this worldview. Patton had little patience for weakness, especially emotional weakness. He believed fear could be beaten out of a man, shamed out of him, or ignored until it disappeared. He had grown up in an era that saw war as a test of character, not trauma. The modern reality of shell shock, exhaustion, and psychological collapse did not fit his model of heroism. To Patton, war was brutal but honest. Those who broke under it had failed a fundamental test. This belief would follow him into disaster. Yet for all his flaws, Patton was not incompetent, nor reckless in the ways his critics often claimed. On the battlefield, he was often terrifyingly effective. He understood movement, momentum, and pressure intuitively. He believed speed saved lives, not caution. The faster a war ended, the fewer men died. And many times, he was right. Patton's units moved faster, hit harder, and confused the enemy. He exploited openings others hesitated to use. Where some commanders saw chaos, Patton saw opportunity. This made him invaluable. It also made him dangerous, because Patton did not know how to turn it off. The traits that made him brilliant in combat made him impossible in politics. He spoke before thinking. He insulted allies. He dismissed civilians. He treated public opinion as irrelevant noise. In a total war fought across alliances, that attitude was explosive. Dwight D. Eisenhower understood this early. Eisenhower was not dazzled by Patton's theatrics, but he was not blind to his talent either. He saw Patton as a weapon, one that required careful handling, useful, powerful, and capable of backfiring. Where Patton sought glory, Eisenhower sought stability. Where Patton valued dominance, Eisenhower valued cooperation. Where Patton wanted decisive blows, Eisenhower needed sustainable victories. Their relationship was never simple. Eisenhower had risen not as a battlefield legend, but as an organizer, a coordinator, a man capable of holding together egos as large as nations. His genius was not charge, it was control. And Patton resisted control by nature. Yet Eisenhower kept him close, because when war demanded speed, Patton delivered. When morale needed fire, Patton inspired it. When enemies needed to be shaken, Patton terrified them. Again and again, Eisenhower found himself making the same calculation. Yes, Patton was difficult. Yes, Patton was offensive. Yes, Patton was a liability. But he won. And as long as he won, Eisenhower was willing to endure the noise around him. That tolerance created a dangerous pattern. Each time Patton crossed a line and survived, the line mattered less. Each time Eisenhower intervened quietly, Patton learned the wrong lesson. He began to believe he was indispensable. That belief would cost him everything. Because war was changing. The enemy was no longer just across the battlefield. It was in headlines, in Allied capitals, in fragile public support back home. Victory was no longer enough. How that victory was achieved mattered just as much. Patton never adapted to that reality. He was a general built for an older kind of war, one where brutality was expected, silence was enforced, and the only audience that mattered was history. Eisenhower was fighting a different war entirely, and as long as Patton remained who he was, brilliant, arrogant, unfiltered, a reckoning was inevitable. The question was never whether Patton would cross a line. It was how many times Eisenhower could afford to pull him back. From the outside, it looked like loyalty. To some, even friendship. But the relationship between Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton was never built on trust or admiration. It was built on necessity. They had known each other for years before the war placed them on the world stage. Long enough for Eisenhower to understand exactly who Patton was, and long enough to know that he would never truly change. Eisenhower had watched Patton up close. He had seen the brilliance and the volatility in equal measure. He knew Patton's temper was not a flaw that could be corrected with discipline or rank. It was part of the engine that drove him, and Eisenhower made a choice early on. He would manage Patton, not reform him. That decision shaped everything that followed. Again and again, Patton pushed beyond what would have ended another officer's career. Again and again, Eisenhower stepped in, quietly, carefully, behind closed doors. When Patton embarrassed the command structure, Eisenhower absorbed the damage. When Patton offended allies, Eisenhower smoothed relations. When Patton disobeyed orders, Eisenhower reframed it as initiative. Not because Eisenhower agreed with him, but because the war demanded results. Eisenhower understood something Patton never fully did. This war was being watched. Every action echoed beyond the battlefield. The Allies were not just fighting Germany, they were holding together a coalition that could collapse under the weight of ego and distrust. Patton, with his blunt language and open contempt for politics, threatened that balance constantly. And yet, Eisenhower kept him. Because Patton delivered what Eisenhower could not afford to lose. When American forces needed a symbol of aggression, Patton provided it. When morale wavered, Patton's confidence acted like a drug. When momentum stalled, Patton forced movement. He was a living embodiment of offensive warfare. Eisenhower knew that removing Patton too early would send a message, not just to the Americans, but to the enemy. It would suggest hesitation, weakness, internal division. So Eisenhower compromised. He placed Patton under tighter supervision. He limited his public exposure. He intervened more frequently, correcting, apologizing, containing. Each intervention bought time, but each one also deepened the problem. Patton came to see Eisenhower not as a superior, but as a safety net, someone who would clean up after him, someone who understood that the rules did not apply to men who won wars. Eisenhower, meanwhile, began to feel the weight of that role. Every defense of Patton cost political capital. Every excuse strained relationships with British commanders and civilian leadership. Every incident raised the same question in Washington and London. How long can this continue? The answer depended on whether Patton could restrain himself. He could not. As the war expanded and the spotlight grew brighter, Patton's behavior became harder to hide and harder to justify. His comments were repeated, his actions scrutinized, his contempt recorded. And Eisenhower found himself standing between a man who refused to adapt and the war that no longer had room for uncontrolled brilliance. This was not a sudden breakdown. It was erosion. The alliance between Eisenhower and Patton was never meant to last forever. It was a temporary arrangement, sustained by urgency and necessity. As the war matured, the cost of keeping Patton began to outweigh the benefits. Eisenhower could feel the moment approaching. The moment when leadership would require choosing not the best fighter, but the safest one. And when that moment arrived, it would not come with a dramatic explosion. It would arrive quietly, through a series of scandals that forced Eisenhower to decide whether Patton was still an asset or something far more dangerous. The trouble with George Patton was never a single incident. It was accumulation. Each episode, taken alone, could be explained away. Misunderstanding, stress, cultural difference, the pressure of command. Eisenhower had heard every defense and used many of them himself. But together, they formed a pattern that grew harder to ignore. Patton spoke as if microphones did not exist. He mocked allies in private rooms that never stayed private. He described the war in language that belonged to another century, unconcerned with how it would sound to civilians who were already paying the price. He dismissed political concerns as cowardice. He dismissed diplomacy as weakness. He dismissed restraint as a luxury for men who had never commanded troops under fire. To Patton, victory justified everything. To Eisenhower, it justified less and less. British commanders complained, not quietly, not subtly. Patton's contempt for their caution, his open ridicule of their methods, strained an alliance that Eisenhower spent every day trying to preserve. This was not a rivalry between generals, it was a threat to unity. Then there were the orders. Patton did not always disobey them outright. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he interpreted them aggressively, creatively, sometimes recklessly. He acted first and explained later, confident that success would erase doubt. Sometimes it did. Other times, it left Eisenhower scrambling to contain the fallout. Every success strengthened Patton's belief that he was right. Every survival reinforced the idea that consequences were for lesser men. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower warned him, firmly, repeatedly. He explained the stakes, the pressure, the fragility of public support. He made it clear that this was no longer a war fought only by soldiers. Patton listened, and then he went right back to being Patton. What Eisenhower began to realize was unsettling. Patton was not reckless because he didn't understand the rules. He was reckless because he rejected them. He believed history would vindicate him, that future generations would forgive everything if he delivered victory now, that leaders were remembered for conquest, not compliance. But Eisenhower was not thinking about statues or history books. He was thinking about headlines, alliances, elections, civilian trust. The kind of war where one general's words could undermine months of careful coordination. Each scandal forced Eisenhower to intervene more openly, to answer more questions, to spend more time defending a man who made defense increasingly difficult. And then came the incident that stripped away all ambiguity. The moment when Patton's worldview collided directly with the reality of modern war. A hospital, a wounded soldier, and a line that could no longer be smoothed over with quiet explanations. For the first time, Eisenhower could not frame it as a misunderstanding. For the first time, he could not protect Patton without exposing himself. And for the first time, the question was no longer whether Patton was effective. It was whether he was still acceptable. The hospital was supposed to be quiet. Men lay in rows of beds, some bandaged, some staring at ceilings they no longer recognized. The sounds of war were distant here, muffled by walls, by medication, by exhaustion. This was where soldiers came when their bodies or their minds could no longer continue. Patton walked through the ward with his usual intensity. He believed hospitals were for the wounded, not the unwilling. And as he moved from bed to bed, he searched for something familiar: courage, discipline, resolve. What he found instead enraged him. One soldier told Patton he could not return to the front. He was shaking. He was exhausted. He was suffering from what we would now recognize as severe combat trauma. To Patton, there was only one diagnosis that mattered: cowardice. He exploded. In front of doctors, nurses, and other wounded men, Patton shouted. He cursed. He called the soldier a disgrace. Then, in a moment that would define his career, he struck him. The room froze. This was not a private outburst. This was not battlefield severity. This was an act witnessed, remembered, and reported. And it cut directly against everything the public believed about how their army treated its own. Patton left the hospital furious, convinced he had enforced discipline. Instead, he had crossed a line that could not be erased by victory. Word spread quickly. Doctors were outraged. Officers were alarmed. The story moved upward through the chain of command until it reached Eisenhower. Stripped of emotion, reduced to facts, but devastating all the same. Eisenhower did not react immediately. He read the report. Then, he read it again. He understood exactly what had happened, not just the slap, but what it represented. This was Patton's philosophy made physical. A worldview where psychological injury did not exist, and mercy was a liability. Eisenhower was furious. But fury was not his greatest concern. Exposure was. This was no longer something that could be handled quietly. If the incident became public, it would damage trust in the army and fuel criticism at home. It would hand propaganda to the enemy and strain relationships with allies who already viewed Patton with suspicion. Eisenhower acted. He summoned Patton. He issued a sharp reprimand. He demanded apologies, not just formal ones, but personal ones. He made it clear that this behavior was unacceptable and would not be tolerated again. And then, he made a decision that stunned many. He did not remove Patton from command. Instead, he shielded him. Patton apologized. Awkwardly, reluctantly. He believed the issue was overblown. He believed, once again, that Eisenhower understood him, that results would outweigh outrage. For a moment, it seemed like he was right. The incident was contained. The press did not immediately explode. Patton remained in uniform. The war continued. But something had changed. Eisenhower's patience was no longer infinite. The slap was not the end. It was a warning. A final demonstration that Patton could not be trusted to understand the limits placed on him. Eisenhower had saved him again. And in doing so, he had tied his own credibility to a man who was running out of chances. Because while Patton believed he had survived the worst moment of his career, the war, and Eisenhower, were no longer willing to absorb another. From the outside, Eisenhower's decision made little sense. Public outrage simmered. Allied commanders were furious. Even within the American ranks, patience was wearing thin. And yet, Patton stayed. Not because Eisenhower excused what had happened, not because he agreed with Patton's philosophy, but because removing him at that moment would have created a different kind of disaster. Eisenhower was fighting two wars at once, one against Germany, another against uncertainty. The Allied invasion of Europe was approaching, and deception mattered as much as firepower. The Germans feared Patton. They believed he was the Allies' most aggressive commander, a man who would lead the main invasion wherever he was seen. That reputation was not accidental. Eisenhower used it. Patton was placed in visible but restricted roles, intentionally sidelined from major operations while being kept in the spotlight. The enemy watched him closely, assuming that wherever Patton waited, the real blow would fall. It worked. German intelligence fixated on Patton, misreading Allied intentions and dispersing forces based on his perceived presence. The man who could not control his mouth became, paradoxically, one of Eisenhower's most valuable tools. This was the cruel irony of it all. Patton was more useful as a symbol than as a commander. Eisenhower understood that removing him entirely would signal to the enemy that Patton no longer mattered, and that would unravel months of careful misdirection. The war was too delicate for that kind of honesty, so Eisenhower delayed. He kept Patton close enough to matter, but far enough to limit damage. He gambled that Patton would endure the humiliation, learn restraint, and wait for another chance. Patton endured none of it well. To him, sidelining was betrayal. Being used as a decoy felt worse than dismissal. He chafed at restrictions, resented oversight, and simmered with anger. He believed he was being punished unfairly, not for failure, but for being honest about war. The more Patton felt constrained, the more dangerous he became. He spoke recklessly again. He vented frustrations to the wrong people. He framed the war in moral absolutes that ignored political reality. Each comment reopened wounds Eisenhower had worked to close. Eisenhower watched this with growing certainty. Patton was not learning. He was not adapting. He was waiting for permission to be himself again. And the war was moving past men like him. Allied leadership was becoming more centralized, more cautious, more political. Victory was no longer just about speed and aggression. It was about coordination, optics, and post-war stability. Patton represented a past that refused to let go. Eisenhower had kept him not out of loyalty, but utility. Once that utility faded, the question would return, sharper than ever. How long could one man's reputation justify the risk he posed? The answer would come not from the enemy, but from Patton himself. Patton believed his moment would come again. He had been sidelined before. He had been criticized before. History, he told himself, always corrected these mistakes. Men like him were too valuable to be ignored for long. But this time, something was different. The war was entering its final, most politically sensitive phase. The defeat of Germany was no longer a question of if, but how, and what kind of world would follow. Words mattered now. Public perception mattered. Allied unity mattered more than ever. Patton did not adjust. Instead, he spoke. In private conversations that were never truly private, Patton expressed views that shocked even those accustomed to his bluntness. He minimized the crimes of the enemy. He framed the conflict in ideological terms that clashed violently with Allied messaging. He suggested that former enemies might soon be useful allies, and that the wrong war had been fought against the wrong people. These comments spread. They reached journalists, politicians, Allied leadership, and finally, they reached Eisenhower. This time, there was no ambiguity, no context that softened the meaning, no operational success that could distract from the damage. Patton had crossed from being controversial to being dangerous. Eisenhower understood the implications immediately. These were not just personal opinions. They were statements that threatened the moral foundation of the Allied cause. They risked undermining everything the war had been presented as, a fight against tyranny, brutality, and systematic violence. Defending Patton now would mean defending the indefensible. Worse, it would mean aligning Allied leadership with ideas they could not afford to tolerate, not in public and not in history. The pressure was immediate and intense. Allies demanded action. Political leadership demanded answers. The press circled, waiting for a signal that would confirm whether Patton was still protected. Eisenhower felt the narrowing of options. This was no longer about Patton's battlefield effectiveness. It was about whether one man's unchecked voice could fracture the narrative of the entire war. For the first time, Eisenhower did not look for a compromise. He did not seek delay. He did not seek containment. He sought resolution. The decision formed quickly, not in anger, but in clarity. Patton could no longer be trusted with command. Not because he was incompetent, not because he lacked courage, but because he no longer understood the war he was fighting. The moment Eisenhower had been postponing for years had arrived, and when he summoned Patton, there would be no argument, only a sentence that closed the door forever. There was no audience, no aides lining the walls, no dramatic confrontation, just two men in a room, bound by years of war, exhaustion, and choices that could not be undone. Eisenhower did not begin with accusations. He did not list Patton's offenses. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to.
Patton stood rigid, waiting for the familiar pattern. Criticism followed by tolerance, anger followed by rescue. He had lived through that cycle too many times to fear it. But Eisenhower broke the pattern. He spoke calmly, almost gently, and in doing so, removed every path Patton expected to take. He told Patton that the war was changing, that leadership now required restraint as much as aggression, that words carried consequences beyond intent, that a general could no longer be judged only by how fast he advanced, but by what his presence represented. Then came the sentence, not dramatic, not cruel, but final. Eisenhower told him that he could no longer be trusted with independent command, that the risk he posed outweighed the victories he might still achieve, that the Army needed discipline, not just on the battlefield, but in judgment. For Patton, the words landed with a weight no shell ever had. This was not a reprimand to be endured. It was not a punishment to be waited out. It was the end of something he had built his entire identity around. Patton did not argue. He did not interrupt. He did not explode. For once, there was nothing to say. Eisenhower was not rejecting Patton's past. He was rejecting his future. The kind of future Patton believed was his by right. In that moment, Patton understood the truth Eisenhower had been carrying for years. Wars are not won by individuals alone. And no man, no matter how brilliant, is larger than the cause he serves. Eisenhower did not humiliate him. He did not strip him publicly. He simply removed what mattered most to Patton: authority without oversight. It was the only decision left. When the meeting ended, there was no handshake, no reconciliation, just the quiet understanding that one era had ended. Patton walked out knowing that the war he was born to fight no longer had a place for him. And Eisenhower remained behind, fully aware that history would judge him not for Patton's brilliance, but for his restraint. The decision did not echo immediately. There was no single announcement, no dramatic headline declaring George Patton finished. Instead, the consequences unfolded quietly, through reassignment, limitation, and absence. The kind of ending that feels almost worse than public disgrace. Patton remained a general in name, but the power was gone. He was no longer trusted with decisions that shaped campaigns, no longer positioned at the center of Allied momentum. The war moved forward without him, efficiently, deliberately, and without the chaos he once brought. For a man who defined himself entirely by command, this was devastating. Patton tried to mask it. He maintained his posture, his discipline, his certainty. But those around him could see the fracture. The energy that once fueled his presence had nowhere to go. He wrote. He complained. He justified himself endlessly. He believed he had been misunderstood, that history would eventually correct the error, that future wars would recognize what this one no longer valued. But history was not waiting. The Allied advance continued. Germany collapsed. Victory arrived without the man who once seemed essential to achieving it. Eisenhower watched all of this with a different burden. Removing Patton solved immediate problems, but it created lasting ones. Critics accused him of sidelining brilliance. Supporters accused him of weakness. Patton's admirers framed the decision as political cowardice. Eisenhower accepted all of it. He understood that leadership was not about being loved, it was about being responsible. The war ended with alliances intact, narratives preserved, and civilian trust largely unbroken. The cost of that stability was a man like Patton, whose talents belonged to a kind of war that no longer existed. Patton never fully recovered from the loss. Without command, he was restless, angry, and increasingly isolated. The battlefield had been the only place where his flaws were tolerated, even celebrated. Without it, there was no buffer between who he was and how the world saw him.
When Patton died shortly after the war, the story was already set. He was remembered as a brilliant, flawed general, a man out of time, a weapon too powerful to be left unsupervised. Eisenhower, meanwhile, moved forward into history as a different kind of leader, one defined not by dramatic victories, but by decisions that prevented catastrophe. The removal of Patton was never about one incident. It was about recognizing when strength becomes instability, and choosing to act before it destroys everything around it. History often demands simple stories, heroes and villains, right and wrong, triumph and failure. The story of George Patton and Dwight Eisenhower refuses to fit that shape. Patton was not removed because he lacked courage. He was not removed because he failed on the battlefield. He was removed because the world he was built for no longer existed. War had changed. It was no longer fought only by soldiers who accepted silence and sacrifice. It was fought in newspapers, parliaments, and public opinion. It demanded leaders who could restrain themselves as effectively as they commanded others. Patton could not. That does not make him weak. It makes him human and tragically misplaced. Eisenhower's choice was not about punishing a man. It was about protecting a cause. He understood that unchecked brilliance can become a liability, and that discipline at the top matters more than genius at the front. The sentence Eisenhower spoke that day was never meant to humiliate. It was meant to end something that could no longer be allowed to continue. Patton remained a warrior until the end, but the war stopped needing warriors like him. And that is the uncomfortable truth history often hides. Greatness without restraint is not leadership. Victory without judgment is temporary. And sometimes the hardest decision is not who to promote, but who to stop. If this story felt different from what you expected, that's because history is rarely what it appears to be. It's shaped by quiet rooms, measured words, and leaders who choose stability over spectacle. If you want more stories like this, stories about power, character, and the decisions that change history, consider subscribing. Not for the battles, but for the moments when someone chose to end one.